Usually when we talk about medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute precision.
Right. Yeah, you want a very clear answer.
Yeah, you go to a doctor, you say your arm hurts, and they take an x-ray. The image comes up on the screen, the doctor points to a jagged white line, and, well, they tell you your bone is fractured.
It is a binary situation. It is either broken or it is not broken.
Right.
And that kind of clarity is comforting. I mean, we like things to be visible, to be categorized neatly, and to have a definitive answer.
But then you step into the world of ancient texts, into historical and theological analysis, and suddenly that x-ray machine, well, it feels like it is malfunctioning.
Oh, totally.
Hmm.
You are looking at a textual landscape that is, honestly, it is muddy.
Muddy is a good word for it. We get lost in the weeds of translation, historical distance, and, centuries of debate. Welcome to Reformed Thinking, by the way.
Glad to be here for this.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into a classic piece of biblical scholarship that actually gives us that x-ray precision back. We are looking at Carl Friedrich Keil and Franz Delitzsch's commentary on Psalm 3.
It is a phenomenal piece of scholarship. What we're doing today is examining how a rigorous, unyielding look at ancient Hebrew grammar radically changes how we read a text.
Because we are not looking at broad themes from 10,000 feet up.
No, not at all. We are looking at the molecular structure of the words themselves, analyzing the verbs, the suffixes, and the musical notations.
And the text we are putting under the microscope is a morning prayer. But it is not a quiet, peaceful morning with a cup of coffee and birds chirping.
Definitely not.
This is a morning prayer written by a king who is currently running for his life from his own son.
The stakes are incredibly high. The king is David, the son is Absalom, and it is quite literally a life and death situation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we even get to the words David is praying in verse 2, we have to look at where this text sits in the book, because texts do not exist in a vacuum.
Right. Their placement in a book matters a lot. That is a crucial starting point.
So what does Keil say about the placement here?
Well, Keil points out a fascinating detail about the architecture of the early Psalter. He views Psalms 1 and 2 as a prologue to the entire collection.
A prologue, so they set the stage.
Yeah. Psalm 1 operates from an ethical standpoint. It contrasts the righteous and the wicked, which fits right into the Hebrew wisdom tradition.
And then Song 2.
Psalm 2 operates from the standpoint of redemptive history or prophecy. It looks at God's anointed king and the rebellion of the nations.
So you have this massive, sweeping two-part introduction. One focuses on personal ethics and the law, and the other focuses on global redemptive history and God's sovereign decree.
Spot on. And then we hit Psalm 3.
Right.
According to Keil, Psalm 3 is naturally the very first morning hymn in the book, which is then immediately followed by an evening hymn in Psalm 4.
A morning and evening prayer back to back.
Yes. Keil argues that a morning and evening prayer are the very first things you would expect to find in a prayer and hymn book designed for the covenant community.
I am going to push back on Keil here, though. Just thinking about the historical situation.
Okay, go.
You are running for your life. Night falls. The woods are dark. Wouldn't a prayer right before trying to sleep make vastly more psychological sense?
Because the fear is higher at night.
Yeah, precisely.
Okay.
I mean, yes, if I am terrified, I am praying at night when the danger feels closest. Why start a prayer book with a morning prayer rather than an evening one?
You know, some older scholars have made that very argument. They suggest Psalm 3 is actually an evening hymn for the reasons you just mentioned.
But Keil disagrees.
Keil rejects that idea entirely. He states that viewing Psalm 3 as an evening hymn rests on a grammatical misconception of the Hebrew text.
Oh, really? A grammatical misconception.
Yeah, which we will get into later when we look at the specific verbs David uses regarding waking up. But from a structural standpoint, placing the morning hymn first establishes a daily rhythm for the ancient believer.
Thinking about it from that structural angle, I guess starting with a morning prayer makes a lot of sense. You have the grand theological prologue of Psalms 1 and 2, and then immediately the text grounds that massive theology into the daily rhythmic life of the individual.
Morning and evening.
Right. It brings the cosmic truth of redemptive history down to the moment you wake up and the moment you go to sleep.
Right.
It is sort of like setting the tone for the day before stepping out the door, rather than just doing damage control at night.
What's fascinating here is the transition from the cosmic to the intensely personal, but there is another transition occurring right at this spot in the book.
What's that?
Psalm 3 is the first text in the collection, specifically arranged for music. It has that superscription, a Psalm of David. That brings us to a significant discussion on decoding ancient musical terms.
Let us get into those terms. The superscription uses the Hebrew phrase Mizmor le David. I know we often just translate that as a Psalm of David, but Keil says there's a very technical distinction happening with that word.
Yes. Keil explains that mizmor is a technical expression. It was likely coined by David himself.
Really, by David.
That is the thought, yeah. It specifically signifies the music itself. It refers to the melody, the instrumentation, and the musical arrangement.
Okay, so it is the music. What about the lyrics?
Meanwhile, another Hebrew word, shur, refers to the lyrics or the poetry.
That is a helpful distinction. So Mizmor is the arrangement, and Shur is the lyric sheet.
Precisely. Keil digs into the root of the word mizmor, which is the verb zamar.
Zamar.
Right. Now, older scholars had some very different ideas about what this root originally meant. Some argued that the root meant to cut off or to prune vines.
Wait, I have to stopping there. How do you get from pruning a vineyard to playing a harp? That feels like an incredible leap of logic.
It does seem like a stretch, doesn't it? The older scholarly argument was that music involves rhythmical division.
Like cutting the time.
Yeah, you were cutting a continuous sound into pieces, creating cisuras and individual syllables. Or perhaps they thought it referred to the physical nipping or plucking of the strings with the fingers.
I mean, I guess that sort of makes sense physically.
But Keil dismisses those ideas as entirely artificial. He notes that the Hebrew language already had a specific functional word for striking strings, which is niggin.
So if it is not about pruning vines or physically plucking a string, what is Keil's explanation for zamar?
Following another prominent scholar named Hupfeld, Keil points out that zamar is an onomatopoetic word.
Onomatopoetic. So the word sounds like the action it describes, like a bee's buzz or a snake's hiss.
Yes, that is the idea. Keil connects it to an Arabic root, ZB.
ZBR.
Right. And that Arabic root describes the buzzing noise of a stylus or a reed moving quickly across writing material.
Oh, wow. So it is the sound of the scratching or buzzing?
From that initial buzzing sound, the word evolved to mean making music in the widest sense. It is not about agricultural pruning or articulated speaking.
That is fascinating.
It is an indirect onomatopoeia for making music, especially with an instrument. So a mizmorn is a hymn expressly designed for musical accompaniment.
I love that linguistic history. The very word for the song carries the buzzing, vibrating sound of the instrument within its syllables.
It really brings the ancient world to life.
But if we are talking about musical terms in this text, we cannot avoid the elephant in the room. There is a mystery word that shows up 3 times in the short text.
I know where you're going with this.
You see it in the text, you read it out loud, and nobody really knows what to do with it.
You are referring to Selah.
Selah. I am looking at the English translations, and if it is not a pause, I am lost. Does it mean play louder?
It is a huge debate.
Because the traditional idea of whispering it or treating it like a full stop often feels awkward in the middle of a thought. What does Keil say about the actual data we have on this word?
First, Keil looks at the sheer numbers. Selah occurs 71 times in the Psalter and 3 times in the book of Habakkuk.
So that is 74 times total in the Old Testament.
Correct. He points out that it almost exclusively appears in psalms inscribed with the name of David or the psalmists famous from David's time.
That is a very specific clustering.
It is. Furthermore, all the psalms with Selah, with just a few exceptions, also have the superscription to the chief musician.
Oh, so that explicitly links the word to musical execution.
Yes, undeniably. It is a musical notation.
But what does the notation instruct the musicians to do? I feel like I have heard my entire life that Selah means to stop and think about it. You know, it is a moment of silence.
Keil vehemently rejects several popular theories, including the pause theory. First, he rejects the idea that it is an abbreviation for a longer phrase instructing the singer to repeat a section.
Like a da capo in Western sheet music.
Right. He notes that such abbreviations simply lack any historical support in the Old Testament manuscripts.
Okay, so it is not a repeat sign. What about the pause?
He rejects that entirely. He says deriving it from a root meaning to be silent is linguistically inadmissible because it is neither Hebrew nor Aramaic in that sense.
So the linguistics just don't support a pause at all?
No, they do not. Historically, the tradition of the Mishnah and several ancient translations, like the Targum, Aquila, and even Jerome, rendered it as a logical or lexical term meaning forever or always.
But substituting the phrase forever in the middle of a sentence completely breaks the grammar of the verse.
That is Keil's main point. Well, his precise argument is that translating it as forever converts an original musical notation into a logical one.
Which completely misses the point of it being a musical term.
Right. To find the true meaning, Keil looks at the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint.
Okay, what did they do with it?
The 70 scholars who translated the Hebrew into Greek centuries before Christ rendered Selah as Absalom.
Absalom. What does that signify?
This Greek term indicates an interlude, especially of stringed instruments, or an intensified playing.
So the oldest translators viewed it as an instrumental interlude, not silence, but music.
Yes. Tracing it back to the Hebrew, Keil argues there is only one verbal stem it can be combined with, and that is salal.
Let's break that down. What does the root salal actually mean in Hebrew?
It means to lift up. We see derivatives of this root in other Hebrew words for a ladder, an ascent, or a flight of steps.
A flight of steps. Okay.
Therefore, the general meaning for Selah is a musical rise.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It is not a pause where everyone goes quiet. It is the complete opposite. It is a musical rise.
Yes, a massive volume increase.
I think of it like the moment in a modern film score where the tension has been building quietly and suddenly the full brass section swells up to heighten the emotion. It is a true Hebrew forte.
That is a highly accurate comparison. Keil argues the current Masoretic pointing of the vowel sounds, which gives us the pronunciation Selah, might be a later imitation by scribes.
So they might have changed how it sounded.
Yeah, originally it might have been pronounced Selah, specifically meaning an elevation.
So it is an elevation of sound.
It is not a note for the singers to sing higher or hold a note. It is a note for the instrumental accompaniment. It means the orchestra joins in, the instruments reinforce the sound, or there is a massive transition from piano to forte.
That completely changes the reading of the text. When you hit Selah, you should not lower your voice or take a breath of silence. You should imagine a blast of horns and a clash of cymbals.
It adds so much drama to the reading.
And having established that massive musical intensity, we have to ask what real-world event demanded such a loud, aggressive musical score?
The superscription of the text provides the historical anchor for this entire analysis. It reads, "A psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son."
So this refers to the historical events recorded in 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 17.
Correct. David's own son has launched a massive coordinated coup.
And David has been forced to abandon the throne in Jerusalem. He's fleeing into the wilderness with a small group of loyalists.
Right, and Keil argues that the specific details in the text of the prayer align perfectly with that historical event.
Like what kind of details?
Well, the text mentions the mockery of one who is rejected by God. This aligns historically with the curses hurled at David by a man named Shimei in 2 Samuel 16.
Oh, right. Shammai threw stones and yelled that God had handed the kingdom over to Absalom.
Spot on. I mean, totally. And the text also mentions danger by night.
Which connects to Ahithophel, right?
Yes, that aligns with the tactical counsel of Ahithophel, who advised Absalom to attack David at night while he was weary in 2 Samuel 17.
And what about the sheer numbers of enemies?
The prayer mentions multitudes of people, which aligns with the massive numbers of Israelites who defected to Absalom's side during the rebellion.
The context is incredibly specific to that moment in time.
It really is.
But that raises a crucial question for you, the listener, to consider. If this entire crisis is centrally about Absalom, why is Absalom's name completely missing from the actual text of the prayer?
It is a glaring omission.
Yeah, David mentions the enemies, the multitudes, the oppressors, but he never names the son who is leading them.
Keil addresses that accents by pointing to the emotional tone of 10 Samuel 18, when David eventually receives word of Absalom's death.
That is a heavy chapter.
Even after all the treason, David experiences intense, paralyzing grief. He cries out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom."
So naming him in the prayer might have simply been too painful for a grieving father.
Yes. The personal agony of a father betrayed by his own flesh and blood supersedes the political reality of the coup.
And it was not just a political coup. It was a severe theological crisis.
How do you mean?
Well, the enemies are mocking him. They are saying there is no help for him in God. We have to ask why that mockery was so plausible to the general public.
Yes.
Why would the people of Israel so readily believe that God had abandoned their anointed king?
Because of David's own public history. Keil brings up the fact that David had plunged himself into a deep abyss of wretchedness through his adultery with Bathsheba.
And the subsequent murder of her husband, Uriah.
Right. This catastrophic moral failure happened just when David had reached the absolute pinnacle of his worldly strength.
So the rebellion of Absalom was recognized as a consequence of that.
Yes, it was part of the series of dire calamities that the prophet Nathan told David would come upon his house because of that specific sin.
So when the enemies yell that God has abandoned him, David's own conscience probably agreed with him at first. He had committed massive public sins.
He really had.
He had given his political enemies the ultimate theological ammunition to claim that God had permanently rejected him.
They look at the disaster of his life, they see him running barefoot out of the capital city, and they conclude that the covenant is broken.
It is a devastating place to be.
Plausible reasons were not wanting for words that gave up his cause is lost. The visible evidence all pointed to divine abandonment.
Which brings us directly into the first strophe, verses 2 and 3, and what Keil calls the grammar of despair.
Yes, let us look at how that despair is constructed in the Hebrew.
David starts by crying out, "Yahweh, how many are my oppressors? Many rise up against me. Many say of my soul, there is no help for him in God."
And then we get our first Selah, the orchestra blasts.
Notice the repetition of the word many.
The predicate is placed at the forefront of the sentence for emphasis. David is completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the opposition.
But the most devastating part of their attack is what they are saying about his soul, about his personal covenantal relationship to God.
They claim he is cut off, and the Hebrew word used for help or salvation here is fascinating.
Let's talk about that word.
The word in the text is yeshuata. It is an intensive form of the standard Hebrew word for salvation, which is Yeshua.
Okay, Yeshuata instead of Yeshua. What does that change?
Keil notes that there is a debate among grammarians about the suffix attached to this word.
The yata part.
Mostly the final ah. Some view it as a double feminine termination. But Keil, aligning with Hupfeld, argues it features an original accusative ah of direction.
An accusative ah of direction. Let us break that down for someone who does not read Hebrew.
Sure.
What does that mechanical grammar rule actually mean for the feeling of the sentence?
It implies a definitive movement or trajectory. The ah suffix gives a directional force to the noun.
So it is not a static concept.
Right. The enemies are not just stating a static present fact about his lack of military help. They are pronouncing a final directional judgment on his inmost life.
That is heavy.
God is the ground of all help, and to have no more help in him is equivalent to being completely rooted out of favor with God. They are declaring his trajectory as completely severed from the divine presence.
I think of this like being mathematically plotted on a graph. The enemies are not just plotting a single dot showing where David is right now. They are drawing a heavy arrow pointing straight down.
That is a great visual.
They are pronouncing a final judgment on his soul, claiming his relationship with God is permanently, decisively over. It is like a modern cancel culture moment, but with eternal stakes.
And because of the Bathsheba incident, the logic seems flawless to the crowd.
If you are listening to this right now, and you have ever felt completely outnumbered, or had people use your past failures to declare that your future is worthless, this is the psychological space David is inhabiting.
This raises an important question regarding how a believer reacts when both open enemies and disconcerted friends agree that their cause is entirely lost.
Because David is facing an overwhelming consensus of doom.
The visible circumstances, running for his life, losing his throne, hearing the curses, they all heavily validate the enemy's theological claim.
That brings us to verses 4 and 5, and how David mentally survives that next minute. How does he counter this visible reality?
Well, he says, "But thou, O Jahve, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of my head. I cried unto Jahve with my voice, and he answered me from his holy hill."
And then another Selah, another massive orchestral swell.
This is where David's posture completely shifts. He is physically stripped of his kingdom, his crown, and his glory.
But he declares God is his shield.
Yes, using the Hebrew word megen, and the lifter of his head. Keil points out a very specific preposition used alongside the word shield here.
What preposition is that?
It is bod. It translates to behind and before, signifying total coverage.
Total coverage. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Think about David walking up the Mount of Olives. We know from the historical account in 2 Samuel 15 that he was weeping.
His head was covered in shame.
And he was walking barefoot. His physical posture is complete humiliation.
Yet in that exact moment, he calls God the lifter of his head.
He cannot physically lift his head in front of the people because of his shame, but spiritually, God is lifting it for him.
It is a beautiful contrast.
And the shield, this begin with the begin preposition, it is not just a piece of metal you hold in front of you.
No, it is not a directional defense against a single arrow coming from the front.
It is a 360-degree force field. It covers him behind and before. It is like something out of science fiction. The enemy is everywhere, but the protection is absolute.
And Keil notes that the grammar of verse 5 reinforces this absolute confidence. The text reads, "I cried unto Jahve, and he answered me."
What does the grammar tell us there?
Keil argues that the Hebrew verb for answered here is not just recording a chronological historical fact.
So it is not David saying, I prayed yesterday and God sent an answer yesterday.
Then what is the verb doing if it is not just recounting history? Wait, sorry, that is precisely what it is not doing.
Right, so what is it doing?
It is expressing an absolute confidence in a future answer based on past faithfulness.
Oh, I see.
The grammar does not require a purely historical sequence. It is the assurance that when he prays, the answer is already a reality.
And the answer comes from a very specific place, his holy hill.
This spatial dynamic is so critical to understand. David had to leave Jerusalem?
He had to leave the physical Ark of the Covenant behind. He actually told the priest to take the ark back into the city, saying, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back.
So David is physically separated from the resting place of the divine presence.
Yes, the hostile force of Absalom's army stands between David and the Ark of the Covenant.
But Keil makes a brilliant observation here. He notes that prayer forces its way to the heavenly cherubim throne.
Even from the wilderness.
David may be physically cut off from the earthly sanctuary in Zion, but there is no spatial barrier between God and the believer.
The earthly ark is left behind, but the heavenly reality it represents is immediately accessible. The answer comes from the true holy hill. That spatial freedom, the idea that you cannot be geographically exiled from God's presence, leads directly to the most physical, bodily action in the entire text.
After declaring this theological confidence, what does David actually do?
He goes to sleep. Verses 6 and 7 say, I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for Jahve sustaineth me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of the people who have set themselves against me round about.
The physiological response to sheer terror is usually insomnia. Your adrenaline is pumping, your heart is racing, you are hypervigilant to every snapping twig.
But David, surrounded by tens of thousands of people trying to kill him, just lies down and goes to sleep. It is an act of sheer defiance.
Keil breaks down the specific Hebrew grammar of this sequence, specifically the word waishana, which translates to, and thus I fell asleep. Once again, we see the of direction attached to a verb.
We saw that earlier with the word for salvation, the directional that the enemies used to say he was going down.
Yes. Here, attached to the first-person verb, the of direction gives the sequence a subjective intensity.
So it is an intense action.
It is not a passive falling unconscious due to exhaustion. It is an active, intentional yielding to sleep. Keil translates it, and thus I then fell asleep.
It is a choice.
It is a retrospective glance at the past night. Waking up in health and safety is the undeniable proof that Jahve is actively supporting him.
The text says, Jahve sustaineth me. God's hand is literally acting as David's pillow.
Because that hand is beneath his head, he is inaccessible to the myriads of troops outside.
But there's a structural anomaly here that we have to point out.
You are looking at the missing Selah.
Right. We had a Selah after verse 3. The orchestra played loud. We had a Selah after verse 5, when God answered from the holy hill.
But here, at the end of verse 7, after David wakes up sustained by God, there is nothing.
The orchestra is quiet?
Why?
Keil's observation on this omission is brilliant. If the instrument struck up boldly and suddenly here, if there was a loud musical blast, it would ruin the tone of the strophe.
It would shatter the peace of the sleeping king.
Spot on. Keil states that this section is not a triumphant shout. The phrase, I will not be afraid, is a quiet, meek expression of calm trust.
A loud forte would clash with the reality of a man resting in the quiet assurance of God's protection.
Furthermore, the crisis is not over. The troops are still out there. A bold, conclusive musical swell would imply the battle is finished. But David still has to offer a cry for help.
Waking up in peace does not mean the threat has vanished. Action is still required. Right, verse 8 says, Arise, O Jahve, help me, O my God. For thou smitest all mine enemies on the cheek, thou breakest the teeth of the ungodly.
The strophe opens with a bold command, arise, or kuma in Hebrew.
Keil traces this specific cry back to the mouth of Moses in Numbers 10.
Okay, what is the context in Numbers?
Whenever the Ark of the Covenant set out on the march in the wilderness, Moses would shout, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered."
So David is linking his current wilderness experience to the historical wilderness experience of Israel. He is calling on the God of the Exodus to take the field.
And Keil notes a very specific pronunciation detail here. The word kuma is accented as milra,
Milra.
meaning the accent is placed on the final syllable.
Why does the accent matter? Why do we care where the emphasis falls on an ancient Hebrew word?
Because the next word in the text begins with a guttural letter.
A guttural letter requires a harsher sound from the back of the throat.
Right. By accenting the final syllable of kuma, the final ah sound is sharply cut off from the guttural initial of the following word.
It creates a hard break.
This separation ensures a clear, precise articulation of the cry for help. It forces the speaker's mouth to pronounce it as a sharp, distinct battle cry.
God is said to arise when he takes a decisive part in the events of this world.
And the imagery David uses for God taking action is violently graphic. Thou smitest all mine enemies on the cheek. Thou breakest the teeth of the ungodly.
Breaking teeth is an intense visual. How does Keil interpret this imagery?
Keil explains that the enemies are being conceptualized as biting monsters. They are wild beasts looking to devour David.
So striking the cheek or the jawbone is not just an insult, like slapping someone's face in a duel.
No, it is a functional strike. Striking the jaw renders the monster harmless. It breaks the teeth that are meant to tear him apart.
David is appealing to previous experience here. He is saying that an ignominious end has always come upon the ungodly who rise up against God's order.
It is a plea for God to act consistently with his nature.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it changes how we view the final verse. Verse 9 says, "To Jahve belongeth salvation, upon thy people be thy blessing."
And we get our final Selah, our final orchestral swell.
Keil defines the root of salvation here, which is Yeshua, by looking at its Arabic cognate, wasia,
Which means to be wide or ample. He defines salvation as breadth.
breadth, like a wide open space.
Yes. Freedom of motion, removal of all straightness and oppression, unclouded prosperity at God's free disposal.
Salvation is not just survival. It is absolute freedom from confinement. And David declares that this complete freedom belongs exclusively to Jahve.
So what does this all mean? Look at the climax of this text.
The final line is, "Upon thy people be thy blessing." We have to pause and feel the shock of this statement.
It is incredibly unexpected.
David is running from tens of thousands of Israelites. His own subjects have rebelled against him. They want him dead. They are the biting monsters he just asked God to break the teeth of.
And his concluding thought is to pray for a blessing to fall upon them.
It is an incredible display of a king's heart.
Instead of cursing his faithless people, he implores a blessing upon those who have been piteously led astray and deceived by Absalom.
Keil makes a striking comparison here, doesn't
He
it?
does. He compares this moment to Christ on the cross praying, "Father, forgive them." It shows the king's heart for his rebellious subjects.
Even in his deepest distress, as the true king, he cannot think of himself before God without also connecting himself with his people.
He does not want their destruction. He wants their deliverance from the deception they are under. The one concluding word of the psalm casts a bright light into the very depths of his soul.
It is the absolute peak expression of faith. He leaves the judgment of the leaders to God, the breaking of the teeth, but pleads for grace for the masses.
It is a highly theological response to trauma.
It really is. To briefly recap what we have covered today, looking at the ancient grammar really brings this morning prayer to life.
From the directional ah that shows the enemy is trying to cancel his eternal trajectory,
To the realization that Selah is not a quiet pause, but a massive, brassy, musical rise.
and the subjective intensity of lying down and sleeping as an act of defiance, we see a king who is physically stripped of everything, relying on a 360-degree force field of divine protection.
And we see that rigorous textual study does not drain the emotion out of the text. It actually amplifies it.
Knowing the pronunciation of kuma, or the onomatopoetic roots of zamar, helps us hear the text the way the original audience heard it.
It clears up the muddy waters and gives us that X-ray precision back. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on the source material we discussed today.
It is a challenging thought.
We looked at how David prayed for the very people trying to destroy him. When you find yourself surrounded by opposition or people acting maliciously against you, what would it look like to genuinely pray for a blessing to fall upon them, trusting that your safety and vindication belong entirely to a sovereign God? Thank you for joining this deep dive on reform thinking.